Thank you very much. Welcome to the big debate. I am Ellen Fantini, the managing editor of the European Conservative, and I'm your moderator. A few words about the structure of this debate, which we really hope will turn into a discussion. Each speaker will be given 15 minutes for their opening remarks. I, the moderator, will then give them about 5 minutes each for rebuttals or replies, and if it appears to me that another round of rebuttals and replies is necessary, I'll encourage that. Otherwise, I may ask questions, or I will turn it over to the audience. At 1 o'clock, we will definitely turn it over to the audience, and the audience members will have a chance to ask their questions. These are questions, not statements in the forms of questions, because the idea is to elicit some discussion with the speakers. So we would ask for short, concise questions for either of the speakers or both. We'll give them a chance to reply, fairly short replies, so that we can do a lot of back and forth with the audience. So, in the About Us section of our website at the European Conservative, we say that we publish a variety of writers and a range of viewpoints on the right, broadly conceived, including but not limited to agrarians, anti-statists, classical liberals, libertarians, decentralists, integralists, monarchists, nationalists, populists, radical localists, sovereigntists, and defenders of the Judeo-Christian and Western tradition. So perhaps that's part of the big tent that's been discussed, and it's certainly where we can locate the subjects of the big debate today. That is national conservatism, perhaps versus libertarianism. Both are powerful but seemingly competing worldviews that sit on two ends of the pro-freedom, or let's say right, center movement. So what, if anything, do these two ideologies have in common? And if they do have anything in common, how can these common points be expanded upon? So I wanted to flip a coin to decide who would go first, but my colleagues here were much more gentlemanly and just agreed on who would go first. So our first speaker will be James Orr. He's the UK chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation, organizer of the National Conservative Conference in London in the UK. He's associate professor of philosophy of religion at the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. He was previously MacDonald postdoctoral fellow in theology, ethics, and public life at Christ Church, Oxford. And before entering academia, he worked as a lawyer in corporate finance at Freshfields and Sullivan & Cromwell. His research interests span analytic philosophy of religion, continental phenomenology, moral philosophy, and political theology. He is joined by our second speaker, Yaron Brook, who was the executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute from 2000 to 2017, and he's now the chairman of their board. He is host of the Yaron Brook Show on YouTube and wherever other fine podcasts are found. He's co-authored many books focused on capitalism and its benefits, the benefits of free markets, including In Pursuit of Wealth, the moral case for finance, Equal is Unfair, America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality, and Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government. He's also a contributing author to Neoconservatism, An Obituary for an Idea, Winning the Unwinnable War, America's Self-Crippled Response to Islamic Totalitarianism, and Big Tent, the story of the conservative revolution as told by the thinkers and doers who made it happen. So, without further ado, James Orr, the floor is yours. 15 minutes, and don't ignore your moderator because I'll be making hand signals. Thank you.
Ellen, thank you very much indeed for facilitating this debate. Thank you to Yaron for agreeing to take part. Thank you especially to the great Robert Tyler for putting this great event together. It's a great privilege to be here. Thank you for having me. So just to look a few remarks, and I'm going to try and be as combative as I can, and I say this as somebody who is a great admirer of libertarianism and indeed a great admirer of Yaron's work. I've read many of his books over the years, and I continue to benefit enormously from the works of the great Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, the work of the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute for Economic Affairs. So I come here not to bury libertarianism, but to praise it for the most part. But I will try and fight the corner for national conservatism, at least as I understand it in the British context. So one of the protocols for the national conservative, in my view, is that we should really be speaking primarily about our respective nations. So I'm going to be relatively silent about the case of the United States, what's going on here in continental Europe, and I'll be speaking where I'm drawing examples. I'll be focusing on Britain. I'll be focusing on the UK. I'm a great believer in the response given by Solon of Athens to the person who asked, what is the perfect society? For whom and at what time? Now, this is the question. For whom and at what time? And I take that to be a paradigmatically conservative response. That is to say, we are allergic as conservatives to abstract utopian schema that we want to fit every single society, coerce every society into conforming to. So that does make us appear rather slippery and mercurial. But for the conservative, it is perfectly consistent, for example, to be pro the Second Amendment to the United States and to be against liberalizing gun laws in countries that have hitherto not had much experience of them, for example. But anyway, let me just kick off. Neuralgia over nationhood has intensified of late. This was especially obvious in the wake of the media reaction to the National Conservatism Conference in London back in May. Some glorious tantrums were provoked right across the spectrum. And this is partly because expressions of national sentiment have begun to puncture the cozy cosmopolitanism forged in the aftermath of the Second World War and crystallized in the civilizational struggle with the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century. There's panic today over the stability of global supply chains, energy dependence on unscrupulous and aggressive new empires that oppose freedom in all its forms, and the continued dominance of financial institutions that not so long ago seemed to be bringing capitalism to its knees. So the case for national retrenchment across the West seems more inescapable than ever, and no more so than here in continental Europe. I say this as cards on the table and confession time, a passionate Brexiteer who grew up in Brussels, so I know whereof I speak. I've been a Brexiteer since I was 13 years old, after the Treaty of Maastricht was passed, making Her Majesty a citizen of the European Union, or Her late Majesty. But continental Europe, look, I mean, I'd like to hear more from you, but it seems to me to be ravaged by the increasingly authoritarian, dirigiste and centralized interventionist ideology of the Brussels oligarchies. And these concerns have catalyzed an international movement led by the wonderful Yoram Hazony and others of so-called national conservatives. This has swiftly emerged, in my view, to be the most promising coalition of figures championing national self-determination in the West today. We don't have, thank God, a little blue book. There is no Tory Torah. We are inspired instead by the unduly neglected English figures of Sir John Fortescue, Sir John Selden, Henry Bolingbroke, to press the case that conservatism is not, as Roger Scruton, the great Sir Roger Scruton, late lamented Sir Roger Scruton, insisted, a hesitation within liberalism. Conservatism precedes liberalism and in many ways provides the conditions of the possibility of liberalism in ways too many to enumerate. It supplies the moral frameworks and the social stability that allowed us, permitted the achievements that liberals would have us believe sprung ex nihilo from the minds of Hobbes and Locke. And this is, probably one key point of difference. The national conservatism insists on the shared religious impulses, customs, notions, norms, habits that prevents a social as opposed to a constitutional revolution. And the sacralizing of freedom would have been as bloody and catastrophic in Britain as it proved to be in France. For us, loyalty to nation, it's worth saying, is not really nationalism. I am uncomfortable, made uncomfortable by the N-word, certainly in the UK context, because nationalism is typically understood to be the sort of post-1848, 19th century romantic kind of nationalism that did blight in many respects continental Europe. That is not really how things have ever been understood in the United Kingdom. The county of Hampshire is older than every European state. We have been blessed by a relatively prolonged millennium, a long millennium of relative peace and stability internally, with a brief aberration with the Puritans in the 17th century. So it is, nevertheless, the pro-nation sentiment is, as I would say, the weakest form of concrete attachment, beyond which really everything else is an abstraction that nobody is going to die for, nobody's going to live for, nobody's really going to honor. But we love what is closest to us. And this is an insight of Augustine and Aquinas and even David Hume. Not often you hear those three figures in the same sentence. Crystallized in the phrase, the law, I think it's the first law allegedly attributed to Robert Conquest, that everyone is conservative about what they know best. And these concentric circles of our affection radiate out from family to kin to village to community to guild and to country, just. But that's the limit, the outer limits of our concrete forms of attachment for the National Conservative is the nation. But it's the weakest form of concrete attachment. We are, as National Conservatives, it is true, more committed than most conservative movements have been in the past to using the power of the state to buttress social norms and insulate the institutional landscape, especially publicly funded parts of it, against capture and corruption by the shock troops of woke progressivism. I wish it were not so, but we are where we are, and we need to deal with society and the world as it is given to us and not as we would like it to be. Social conservatism 2.0 may seem unthinkable in a nation like the UK, which is as socially liberal as Britain, but insofar as it's conserving some of the most self-evident prerequisites to human flourishing, National Conservatism's strain of social conservatism is an important one. It's very different from social conservatism 1.0. We are unambiguously committed to resisting the alarming proliferation of strange new dogmas, of a new public faith that has sacralized gender ideology, divinized sexual minorities and ethnic minorities. This has, by the way, genuine electoral appeal across the old political divides. It's now routine for even the most liberally inclined of my friends and colleagues to express alarm at the rise of transhumanist technologies, the increasing indifference to human life before cradle and before grave, the nation's plummeting birth rates, the continuing corrosion of the family, and the nationalization of childcare. Indeed, across an array of cultural and biopolitical questions, national conservatisms now find themselves in a coalition with unfamiliar allies, ranging from Marxist or libertarian atheists, hi Frank, to Mumsnet activists and gender-critical feminists. Now, there are real substantive ideological differences here. This is a strange coalition of convenience, but we need it, and we need to hold it together, and National Conservatism in the UK, at least, is committed to holding that coalition together and making it stronger. We need to dismantle the grievance industrial complex and to protect children from indoctrination into new ideological norms and narratives that are as poorly evidenced as they are politically partisan. So these are, this just very briefly, I've got six or 7 minutes to go. I mean, that is the sort of that is what national conservatism is, at least in its British expression. Points of disagreement with the libertarians. Well, the most obvious, I suppose, is that, look, we are committed to the Burkean ideal as national conservatives, that society is not an aggregate of featherless bipeds that just happen to occupy a random landmass. Apologies, that's a bit of a caricature of the libertarian position, but I mean, let's make it a caricature for the sake of debate. We're committed rather to the view that society is made up of natural groups, family, locality, church, regions, guilds, social classes, nation. Burke's attack on the French Revolution is so often, a revolution in the name of the individual and individual rights destroyed these traditional groups. And really the conservatives, the thinkers, the great thinkers that followed Burke, effectively accepted this, even some liberals like Lamennais and Tocqueville. So the Burkean impulse is to say to the libertarian that absolutizing a doctrine of individualism is just as much of a menace as to the social order and true freedom of a society as the absolutizing doctrine of collectivism. Dissolving society into a sandheap of individual particles, each claiming natural rights, makes the arrival of the very collectivism that the libertarian abhors, I think, inevitable. More and more, I just have the impression, talking well, I can't find any libertarians at the University of Cambridge, unsurprisingly, but of the few dear friends I have who I would self-identify as libertarians in London, they sometimes talk about family and guild and church in ways that make it seem as if there is those natural groups are as hostile to freedom as the government itself, and that makes me uneasy. Second main point of disagreement would be the insistence by conservatives, national conservatives, that freedom must be balanced with order and authority. That true freedom is not the raw, anarchic freedom of the man alone on a desert island. That true freedom, the only freedom worth having, is that freedom that is ordered freedom, that is freedom that has before it the enabling conditions of freedom. Faith, family, and flag, to give you a neatly alliterative phrase. Society is a plurality of authorities, parent over child, priest over believer, teacher over master. Freedom requires social and moral authority. It doesn't need to be coercive, it doesn't need to be dictatorial. Usually it's the gentle, loose, protective authority that the parent has over a child or the teacher has over a student. But it is authority nonetheless, and it is an enabling condition of freedom. This is something that people find very, I think, my students certainly find very difficult to grasp, that the paradox that limits can be liberating. And the suspicion is, the worry is, that libertarians cannot quite strike the balance between authority and order on the one hand and freedom on the other. Excessive liberty without order removes the social scaffolding and the moral compass and confidence of a nation. So we're not a wasteland of isolated, atomized individuals. We don't want that, because that's going to lead to excessive dependence on the state. Marriage is a good example of this. Marriage gives life meaning. It's a civilizational good. It's a solid foundation. It builds prosperity in society. It is an antidote to welfare dependence. It protects children. It produces good future citizens. If people aren't married to each other, they will end up being married to the government. Libertarians, I worry, can't explain why we should prefer our neighbors and our nation over any other. All that said, in the remaining 1 minute, we're in the trenches together. We've got to work out how to get along. That's why I was very clear to invite the great liberal defenders of sovereignty and freedom back in May, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, Lord Daniel Hannan, Lord David Frost. They are on our team, despite some prickly write-ups from the IEA and the Cato Institute. We're trying to craft a new form. I'm not going to use the word fusionism. This is not neo-fusionism. but nevertheless, we have to recognize that we share a common enemy, and we need to tie ourselves together no more, and that is no more true of the UK that's more true of the UK than at least anywhere else. So we need each other. We need some libertarian thinking in our economic policies as we're realizing 1 year on for the collapse from the coup against the Truss government and the attempt to run something close to a libertarian pack of libertarian policies. Look how that worked out. Not because the policies themselves were disastrous, but really because the country simply wasn't ready for it. And so the argument still needs to be one there. We need libertarian thinking, but I would say that the libertarians need us even more than we need them. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your disciplined attention to the time. And now we'll turn the floor to Yaron Brook.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here. I was at the conference 2 years ago, and a little surprised I was invited back, so thank you for inviting me back. Not sure exactly who I'm representing here. It's not like libertarians, would necessarily consider me a spokesman for them. So I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a committed individualist, and in terms of where you want to put me politically, I'll leave that up to you. I think we're in real danger of giving up on the great achievement that is Western civilization. I think we're at a crossroads, and we're going to have to decide as cultures whether we are going to sustain this great progress that has been made under the banner of Western civilization. And my fear is that the right is getting to the point of misrepresenting what Western civilization really has achieved and where it has come from. I think, the West, the last 250 years are an amazing human story. They're the most important human story, I think, since human beings came to this earth, right? This is a story of great achievement. The kind of economic progress, the kind of cultural progress, the kind of achievement that as human beings we have succeeded in is unprecedented in all of human history. You've all seen the graphs of what's happened over the last 250 years. And if we misdiagnose what caused that, if we misdiagnose what the nature of that achievement is, we are likely to lose it. It is not an achievement of old ideas. It is an achievement of new ideas. It is an achievement of a breaking of tradition, not a sustaining of tradition. The Enlightenment developed from its roots, I think, in the Renaissance. But the Enlightenment represents a break from European history, not just a continuation of ancient history. It is an identification, in my view, of two fundamental ideas as crucial for human survival and crucial for human progress. The idea that reason should be our guide, that the human mind is capable of knowing reality. This is Isaac Newton's great contribution, I think, to the Enlightenment. It is no accident that the Enlightenment, the political Enlightenment, goes hand in hand with scientific achievement, goes hand in hand with the scientific revolution. Knowledge is achievable, truth is achievable, and it's achievable by means of reason, not by means of an ancient book, not by means of revelation. And individuals are the ones who reason. And the individual is the unit that makes up society. The individual is what matters. And individuals have that capacity to discover truth and to reason. It's this rise of individualism. It's this rise of the idea of that individual can take care of himself, can prosper, can be successful, that the state, the authorities, whoever, does not get to dictate to the individual what his particular values should be. Does not get to dictate to the individual what profession he should pursue, who he should marry, what he should think. But the liberty that every individual has to pursue his values based on his mind, and the respect, therefore, that the individual gained politically during this period is what I think ultimately led to the flourishing that we saw during the Industrial Revolution and all the way to today. So this question of individualism versus collectivism is maybe the most important, certainly in politics, the most important question that we have. Is the individual sovereign? Is the individual both capable of, and does he have a right to, live his life for his own sake based on his own judgment? Or is he just a member of a collective to be dictated to how he should live, what he should do? And then it's just a question of how much liberty do we give him? How much freedom do we allow him to have? And in what realms do we allow him to have that freedom? Is life, should life be pursued by permission, or should we pursue a permissionless society? I think that's the most important political question on the table, and this is where I struggle to find alliance with national conservatives or national anything or conservative anything, in a sense that the national conservatives, as do all collectivists, view some kind of form of collective, a nation, a tribe, a group, as above the individual, as more important than the individual, and as dictating, therefore, the values and the life and the pursuits of the individual. That is the political spectrum, in my view, should not be left and right. It should be individualism, collectivism. And to the extent that the left and right both adhere to collectivist views, to that extent, they're both enemies of the individual. They might be enemies in different regards. They might be enemies at different points in time. It might be very much true that the left right now is the primary enemy that must be defeated. But it is collectivism which is the challenge. It is individualism that led us to the wealth and prosperity and freedoms that we have today. And it is collectivism that is risking all of that and is moving towards, dragging us towards the end of this kind of prosperity. And I'd add peace. I think one of the things that individualism ultimately leads to is the emphasis on peace. Individuals are not keen to go, die on the barricades. There has to be a really good cause to get an individualist to go and fight on the barricades. It is the rise of collectivism, in my view, which is partially responsible for the increased threat of war, and the existence of war, and of course the increased threat of war around the globe. We're entering now a Cold War II, without really knowing who started it, why we're doing it, how do we stop it? Does anybody really want to stop it? I don't see anybody wanting to stop it. It seems like both in the U.S., both left and right seem to be eager to accelerate our descent into some form of Cold War. We've got a war in Russia versus Ukraine, which is very much triggered by I believe Russian nationalism and by empire seeking. It is these ideas, these collectivistic ideas, that I think are putting the achievements of Western civilization at real risk and in real danger. So I fear for the future. I fear for the future because of the rise of these ideas, on the right and on the left. I'm not sure where you would. I'm not sure where we put. I don't know, Putin these days. Is he right? Is he left? Where does he belong on the political spectrum? Is he an ally? Is he an enemy? I mean, one of the most ugly phenomena I see on the American right today is a affiliation with Putin, an affiliation with Russia, a justification of Putin and Russia in the name of fighting the left. He is our ally, after all, because he hates the left. Is that a good reason to align with a thug, a monster like Putin? Allow me to be skeptical about that. So I think we need to rediscover our roots, and our roots are not in the collectivism of the past. Our roots are not in the collectivism of pre-Enlightenment Europe that led to nothing but bloodshed. Our roots are individualism, as framed by John Locke, as framed by the great Scottish Enlightenment, as framed even by the French Enlightenment. And let me just say something about the French Revolution. The French Revolution was an anti-Enlightenment revolution. Rousseau is an anti-Enlightenment figure. He's a collectivist. He's much more of a traditionalist than the real Enlightenment figures. He rejects the very principles on which the Enlightenment was founded: reason, science, and individualism. The French Revolution is the opposite of the real Enlightenment revolution, which was the American Revolution. The American Revolution is a revolution of individualism, and therefore is a revolution, a real revolution, and is what stands in counter to the French. The French Revolution is much more of a leftist revolution, a revolution of socialists and collectivists. So I'm supposed to say a few things on how we can work together, or should work together. I hope at the very, so it's a challenge, I think, to work together. We have to recognize that. There are real disagreements here, not superficial. They go to the heart of what politics should be about. They go to the heart of what life is about. They go to the heart of very foundational principles of morality and politics. So we should not, first of all, minimize the disagreements, otherwise we get nowhere. I think to the extent that there is a shared agreement about economic freedom and economic liberty, that should be pursued. I worry, at least in the United States, and I don't know what the UK National Conservatives hold, but certainly in the US, and in the 10 Principles of National Conservatism that were published by Yom Hazony in the United States, that we do not share economic liberty, but to the extent that we do, great. Let's fight at least for those freedoms. To the extent that there is still some respect for individualism and individual, and by the way, individualism does not mean living on a desert island. I mean, that would be anti-individualist. I live on an island, but not on a desert island, and there's an airport nearby. And I love hanging out with other human beings. As self-interested as I am, I love other human beings because they are real value to me. Individualists love to gather and to associate and to socialize. We even like the nation state. I actually just came back from a debate in New York. On Monday, I did a debate in New York with Brian Kaplan. Some of you might know Brian Kaplan, who's an economist from George Mason University, who was defending anarcho-capitalism. I was defending the state. So individualists love the nation state when it's a free nation state, when it's a nation state that protects the individual from coercion, from force, and from the real enemies of liberty, which is authority with a gun, backed up by a gun. That is the real enemies of freedom and liberty. So to the extent, we might share some ideas about parts of foreign policy. We might share some suspicion of overly interventionism, too much interventionism, too much attempts to project American power globally and internationally, and coerce other countries to establish democracies or to establish values by force. So there might be areas in which we can cooperate, but let's not forget that even when we cooperate on those areas, that there are real fundamental differences that guide the motivation for each side. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think we should do a round of replies and rebuttals. 5 minutes each, with James Orr first.
Good. Thank you, Yaron, very, very much indeed. Lots to agree with there, quite a lot to disagree with. So quickly, I mean, look, on the Enlightenment, this idea that reason springs from Zeus's limbs in 1776, 1770, 81, I just think it's just not true. There's plenty of reasoning going on in Plato and in Aristotle and in Aquinas and in Augustine and in Occam and in Scotus. This is not something that is new to the late 18th century. In fact, if you look at a lot of my favorite Enlightenment philosophers, David Hume and Adam Smith, they are extremely skeptical of reason. Reason is and can only ever be the slave of the passions, fit only to be her slave. So there's a part of the genius of Smith and Hume, it seems to me, is to have a certain healthy skepticism towards reason and to be attentive to the non-cognitive dimensions of our engagement with reality. I also question whether or not individualism and the doctrine of and the sacralizing of the individual is the best, or let alone the only explanation for the extraordinary, and I would not question these for a minute, the extraordinary successes that capitalism has brought to the world in the last 200 years. And again, I think it's part of Hayek's genius to recognize that it's not so much the individual as individuals allowed the freedom to interact with one another and to, as it were, shape society in ways that rely on a kind of collective wisdom and rationality that is too big for a single head. And Hayek, it seems to me, has a great respect for tradition, the wisdom of tradition, and a great respect for the basic conservative outlook that ideas age in reverse. We get weaker as we get older, ideas get stronger, and the longer they've been around, there should be a defeasible presumption that they've got something worth telling us. That includes old books, old ideas, and even, dare I say it, old sacred texts. Peace and war, well, yes. I mean, to the extent that there is skepticism of the Ukraine war in the United States, I note that it does come from figures who would certainly align closely with the National Conservative movement. I think there would be a similar skepticism to crazy foreign ventures. In fact, I think National Conservatives distinguish themselves very sharply from the catastrophic consequences of neoconservatism in the early years of this century. But again, we are where we are. What is the libertarian response to an unprovoked imperialist invasion of a sovereign nation state? It surely can't be the principle that appeasement and conscientious objection are the order of the day at all times and in all places. That, thank God, was not the view of the British elites and the Allied elites in World War I or in World War II. So, yes, hearty agreement that we shouldn't be starting crazy wars, but once they're started by others, enemies of freedom, we should step up to the plate and not allow the enemies of freedom to trample all over our freedoms.
Thank you for that. 5 minutes to you.
Yeah, so quickly on reason. Yeah, of course, reason has its origins in ancient Greece. In many respects, I think those are the roots of Western civilization. It's again, I'm not sure who we represent here, but Hume sets the seeds for, unfortunately, the decline of the Enlightenment because of his deep-rooted skepticism of reason. I think that is a basic flaw towards the end of the Enlightenment that we are still fighting and we're still dealing with to this day. Again, individualism does not assume that individuals on desert island and don't interact with one another. Of course they do. Markets are markets of individuals. But to negate the individual in the name of a collective is what I'm criticizing. Individuals have to work together under the rule of law, under the defense of individual rights, under a proper perception of rights, which I think Locke did a pretty good job of presenting. That is what has led to our success. It is the focus on the individual. It is the focus on individual initiative. It is the focus on a permissionless, or relatively permissionless society, and the ability of entrepreneurs to drag us kicking and screaming into the future. Kicking and screaming. There's not a single innovation that we did not, in the name of some interest group, in the name of some tradition, did not try to stop, whether it's driverless cars right now, or artificial intelligence, or Uber, or all the other inventions going back to the steam engine that were resisted by traditionalists. So the future progress is a future progress imagined by individuals and created by individuals in interaction with other people, in cooperation with other people, in voluntary association with other people. That is what has led to the great success. And of course, the United States is this amazing experiment that has worked pretty well so far, although one wonders about its future, but has worked pretty well so far. I think the United States and the UK have really, to the large extent, dragged the rest of the world forward through innovation and progress. These are the countries where, almost all the innovations over the last 250 years have come from, as uncomfortable as that may be for many, because they emphasize the idea of individualism. They emphasize the idea of individuals free in markets to pursue their values, their ideas, and their progress. I think there was some misunderstanding about my position in Ukraine. I am absolutely for supporting Ukraine. Indeed, I blame the West for not supporting Ukraine enough and holding it back quite a bit, particularly the Biden administration. We approved tanks, but a year late. We approved F-16s, but a year and a half later. My concern is it's exactly the opposite, that indeed it is those affiliated with national conservatism, or some of those affiliated with national conservatism in the United States, who are skeptical about the Ukraine and about resisting because, and here I'm basically going off of Jordan Peterson, right? Jordan Peterson is skeptical of the support for Ukraine. Why? Because Putin, for him, represents the West. Putin, for him, is the good guy because he stands with the Judeo-Christian tradition and he stands in opposition to the left, because on family values, Putin is our ally. Now that to me is sickening. It is literally sickening to affiliate with a thug because he supposedly shares an enemy, right? I don't think I share anything with Putin. So this to me is scary about what is happening on the right. And by the way, some libertarians on the right as well, right? So this is American libertarians and American conservatives. There's way too much hostility to Ukraine and friendliness towards Russia on the right today. And again, it is a barrier for people like me, at least, to find common ground. I find common ground much more with people in Europe who get it, I think, who get who Putin is and what he represents than they seem to do in the United States. Look, an individualist foreign policy is a foreign policy that says that to the extent that there are threats to the individual rights of your citizens, it is your responsibility to defend them, to protect them. And there is no question that Putin represents a threat to the individual rights of American citizens. Certainly, it represents a threat to the individual rights of Europeans. And to the extent that we can help somebody else fight a war to protect us from him, to that extent, we should support it.
Thank you very much. I think we could spend the next 4 or 5 hours doing 5-minute rebuttal statements and probably enjoy it very much. But I think probably the audience is really eager to dive into this. I don't know if we have microphones for the audience. Okay, so I'm going to ask people to line up. I think that's the only way to do it, because otherwise hands go up at various times. Just there's fine.
The mic is in the back. It's coming to you.
Yes. I think this is the easiest way. Otherwise, my nearsightedness will seem ideological. Okay, so ground rules again. These are questions. You can provide context for the question, but do try to make it short. If it's for one of them, let us know. If it's for both of them, let us know. Thanks.
So this is primarily for James. It seems to me that the fundamental disagreement that you have is over reason. And as you said, reason is the puppet of the emotions. I mean, you quoted Hume on that. And it's, if you are going by emotions, if you say that what drives you is this feeling of belonging to the country or something of the sort, then why is Yaron on this panel and not someone representing the modern left? Because they also go by feelings. So in terms of how you go about things, wouldn't you have more in common with someone who goes by emotions? The only difference would be the type of emotion, and they're wrong on the emotion that they hold.
Just to be clear, I was simply making the point that some of the great figures of the Enlightenment, I know Yaron doesn't think they are part of the Enlightenment, if David Hume is not a paradigmatic Enlightenment philosopher, I don't really know who is. And I'd say the same is true of Rousseau. I was simply making the point that just as reason precedes the Enlightenment, non-reason, appealing to non-cognitive dimensions of our engagement with reality, is also is something that gets special emphasis in the Enlightenment. So it was really just it was a corrective. But yes, I mean, I think that it is easy for us to elevate reason with a capital R and to think of it in sort of Kantian terms, purely in terms of sort of, I don't know, ratiocination. There are many, and I don't want to be a postmodernist here, but I'm simply saying that there are many different modes of rational engagement with the world as we find it. And some of those forms of rationality will be more powerful when dispersed, as Hayek saw, diachronically across a tradition and synchronically with the price mechanisms within at any given point in a society. And none of those, those are insights that develop and get a special force and energy in the wake of the Enlightenment. But no, I'm not sort of appealing to emotion and homo psychologicus. I resent and resist the therapeutic culture and the triumph of the therapeutic in all its forms. But I don't want to swing too hard in the other direction and simply say that individual ratiocination should be the benchmark for what reason consists in.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. The importance here of reason. And we can discuss Hume later, but the importance here of reason is, without identifying reason as man's, I think, basic means of survival, the way in which we succeed in life, the way in which we choose our values and strive towards our values, one has a hard time allowing individuals the freedom that I think they deserve. It leaves it open to others, right, to dictate our values for us. And so the idea that individuals can take responsibility for their own lives and thrive by using their own minds is crucial to the very idea of liberty and freedom. And without it, I think that idea falls and you get authoritarian government where somebody else gets to dictate our values to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question. And once you've asked your question, if you could just hand the microphone to the next person in line, that would be helpful.
The line's disappeared.
My question will be to our libertarian representative. You mentioned that Isaac Newton's great contribution was declaring that a man has the ability to know reality through reason. I'm paraphrasing. And there is another quote that he's very famous for. And that is, if I saw further, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. So that is a recognition of something else, that we do stand on the shoulders of tradition, of other men, of the intellectual community that came before us, the moral community that created us. and just all around the conditions that made us being there possible. So my question is, can you concede the difference between a community and a collectivism, or community and a collective? And the community, in my mind, would be something like a family, a congregation, a nation, and collectivist unit would be something that I grew up in. Some communist utopia of egalitarian blobs. And this is my question, community versus the collective. Can we agree that there is a difference?
Yes, I definitely think there's a difference. I am all for community and very against collectives. And the fundamental difference is that a community is a community of individuals. You can leave it, you can enter it, it's a voluntary association. You get to decide about which community you choose. Now, you know, I'm an immigrant. I've moved my entire life from place to place, and ultimately I've chosen where I want to live. I've chosen my community. I've chosen who to affiliate with. Collective is something that's imposed on you. It's very difficult, and sometimes you choose that imposition, but it places the collective above the individual. The collective then becomes more important than the individual. You know, all of our political leaders talk about you should all strive to sacrifice for greater good. Really? What greater good? The greater good of a collective, of the nation, of my tribe, of my. That's what I reject. Yeah, I'm willing to fight for liberty and freedom, but that's because they're values to me, not because they're values to some group that has imposed them on me. So collectivism is the placing of the collective above the individual. Community is a collection of individuals who choose to be part of that community. Look, the pretense here is that we don't have families. I have a wife. I have 2 children. I have a family. But I also, pursued my own life, and if that meant moving 5,000 miles away from my parents, so be it. So I didn't stick to family because that's the be and end all. The be all, end all is ultimately my life, my values for me, right?
James.
Can I just add very quickly on Newton and this idea that the scientific revolution emerges only because of this sudden vogue for empiricism in the late 17th and 18th centuries ignores the enormous role that a creationist monotheistic religious framework had to play in the approaches of our great scientists, in Copernicus and in Kepler, even Galileo, and is certainly Newton himself, who wrote a great deal more theology than he did physics. And this is the so-called Needham problem. Why is it that advanced civilizations like China, far more advanced millennia ago than us, did not bring up a Newton or a Darwin or a Kepler or a Copernicus? There was a basic conviction, religiously inspired conviction, that nature would give up its secrets, that it was intelligible because it is the product, the created outcome of a rational, a supremely rational purpose. And had Newton rejected all of that, then I don't think we would have had the same energy in the scientific revolution as was uniquely the case in monotheistic cultures.
Yeah, so can I, because you did say about Newton and standing on giants. I completely agree that we stand on giants. We're probably going to disagree who the giants were, but I definitely agree that all knowledge builds on previous knowledge. But look, if we're going to define why China didn't advance as much as the West, the roots, in my view, are far more the fact that China never had an Aristotle than that China never had a Judeo-Christian tradition. It is Aristotle who brings to the forefront reason and science. It is Aristotle that has a metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, and that integrates the three. It is the rediscovery of Aristotle by the Catholic Church through Thomas Aquinas that brings those ideas back, in a sense, and establishes them part of the Christian tradition. But it's that secularism that I think also lays the foundations for Renaissance and therefore for Enlightenment. And during this entire period, what is happening is that religion is slowly being, its power and its importance are slowly being reduced and placed into the personal, as a personal issue, rather than as a political, scientific, epistemological and metaphysical issue. And yes, everybody was religious in the 18th century, and almost everybody was religious in the 18th century and previously. But religion played a smaller and smaller and smaller role, and a greater and greater and greater role was played by reason. And it's that opening that allows for the scientific revolution to happen, and it's that rediscovery of Aristotle and the Greeks that allows that to happen. There's nothing in the Old Testament that brings about the existence of science.
Yeah. Can I just ask a question to both of you, which is motivated by my concern that there's a false polarization between tradition and the individual. I mean, my reading of the Enlightenment is that it wasn't just simply Hume, but even people like in the 19th century, like Mills, who really represented liberal ideals in its most systematic form. Spencer, and all these individuals recognized the importance of tradition, but that's just by the by. My question is very simple. At a moment when both tradition and the individual is under fierce attack, when there's a veritable civilizational war being waged against both of these kind of concepts, which are crucial, I think, for everybody in this room. I don't think there's anybody in here who doesn't appreciate the role of the individual. There's nobody in this room, I think, who doesn't understand that their roots in some way or shape or form constitutes who they are. Human beings, by definition, are historical beings with clear roots. Isn't it the case that everybody in this panel and this room has got something in common in having to defend a civilizational perspective, a civilizational outlook that gave meaning to tradition and gave meaning to the individual? And it seems to me that our differences aside, we got to find a way that instead of having a false battle between these two concepts, there are some genuine differences. We have got to find a way of giving a validation and an authority to these two concepts, because otherwise we're going to lose the battles from within the West by people who are against both of these concepts.
But here's the challenge. There are people in this room who would like to impose their values on me. There are people in this room who would like to tell me how to live my life. There are people in this room who would like to tell me who to trade with and who I can't trade with. There are people in this room who would like to limit my ability to move from place to place and where I should live and where I can't live and where I can't live. So there are people in this room who might say they're pro the individual, but then want to limit me as an individual in terms of how I live and where I live and what I consume and who I engage with and who I associate with. They want to limit my freedom and my liberty, and that is a challenge. And that's why it's important for us to have a robust debate and to have these disagreements aired, and maybe we can come to agreement and maybe we can't. But I'm not willing to give up, in the name of fighting the left, to give up my liberty over here in order to fight. I've got two parties who are trying to take away my liberty. I get to choose. Maybe you guys want to take away less of my liberty than the left. But I'm not willing to give up any of my liberty, at least not until, and I'm willing to fight in order to preserve it. So we should have this discussion as debate. I should be in a position to at least try to convince you to leave me alone. Because that's all we're asking for, right? Is leave the individual free to pursue his own life and don't impose your values on them. And as long as you're willing to do that, I don't care what values you pursue. I don't care what traditions you follow. You can follow any traditions you want, as long as you don't force me to follow the traditions you think are appropriate.
James.
I don't think I've ever quoted the English socialist R.H. Tawney favorably before, but I'm going to do so now. Freedom for the pike is death for the minnow. It's all very easy to say, I'm going to move 5,000 miles away from my parents because, I want to move to this beautiful island. And wonderful. That is not the case for everyone. That is not the case for every section of society. And the Conservative point of view is that we are all in this together. That does not mean, that's not a recipe for collective coercion. It's certainly not a recipe for cosmopolitan coercion, that we're seeing increasingly among the globalists in Davos. We passionately resist that. But we have to think of ourselves as a national community, as a moral community, and that is sometimes going to involve constraints on individual freedoms. You'll all be familiar with the tragedy of the commons. The libertarian solution to that seems to be to just get rid of the commons. I don't see how that really improves things. If I suddenly take some glorious piece of the national forest in the United Kingdom and it's all privatized, I might very well just cut it all. Maybe the rational thing to do would be to cut it all down and sell the timber and make a profit. When in fact the rational thing to do would be to open up some camping holidays and hand the thing on to my children and my grandchildren and so on and so forth. So look, there are you can consult the textbooks, but there are obviously justifiable circumstances where individual freedom must be constrained, not least to enable true entrepreneurship and individual freedoms. We need protection of property rights. We need the enforcement of contracts. We need secure borders. We need clear democratic mechanisms in order to set in place the conditions of the possibility of free enterprise and free trade.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Thank you for the incredible debate and discussion. I have the honor of seeing Yaron Brook debate twice in 1 week on 2 continents. So, but I'm wondering if this great debate can be boiled down to a simple question. And this question will have 3 parts to it, though. But the first is, can the simple question be, what's the better organizing policy principle, my nation first or freedom first? So the second part is that, I would suggest from history that my nation first is extremely problematic, having, probably driven World War I and World War II. And that freedom first is a far better organizing principle and gets around the problems that you just mentioned if you're considering maximizing everybody's freedom, not just the freedom of the pike, right? Everybody's freedom. So isn't that a slam dunk win for Yaron? And third, maybe isn't the compromise that it's a reasonable position for citizens of any nation to say, British freedom first or American freedom first, in consideration of the globe, that you have to think about your nation's freedom first, and that you're standing on solid ground, Mr. Orr, when you say British freedom first, because you have a long tradition of British freedom, and that makes more sense than just Britain first, right or wrong. Mm-hmm. So 3-part question, have at it.
No, I take your point. But I think it's simply a false dichotomy. The idea that to be in favor of freedom for my own nation means to be opposed to the freedom of other nations. It simply doesn't follow. Loving my country, I love my wife. That doesn't mean I hate all other women.
Careful.
I love my country, and in fact, it's because I love my own country that I recognize the love for the country of others, particularly at gatherings like this. That I love. What I love about Hungarians is that they're Hungarian and that they love Hungary. What I love about the French is that they love France and they are pro their own freedoms. Now, First World War, Second World War. Let's not go down those rabbit holes. Was it nationalism? Was it a kind of an imperializing ambition? Ideology played a role, of course, in the Second World War as well. Look, it doesn't seem to me that there's anything intrinsically belligerent in the pro-nation position that is not true of, say, a collectivist position or an imperializing nation state. And, well, was just trying to think of an example of a libertarian state. I mean, maybe true libertarianism has never been tried. I mean, has it been tried? I mean, if it is such a slam dunk for Yaron, why hasn't this perfect philosophy been implemented? Where has it been implemented? I mean, I can't think of any examples. Switzerland?
Well, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if you were finished.
We
in
have
terms
test
of where's
cases?
it been implemented, I certainly think the northern states of the United States during the 19th century was as close as we've ever come, and they did really, really well. I think Hong Kong is not a bad example in the 20th century, and even Great Britain, there were periods in its liberal heights in the late 19th century where it came close. So it's come close, and when it has come close, it's done phenomenally well. So I'd argue that maybe we should just continue that experiment a little bit more and make it more consistent and do even better. The challenge is that I think the challenge was that it was not fully grounded intellectually and philosophically because the Enlightenment didn't complete its project. But that's a whole, there's a whole discussion there. Let me just say, freedom first, absolutely. Look, I grew up in a country that, when I grew up at least, was very much nation first. You grew up with a whole idea of your purpose in life was to sacrifice for the state. Every song, every story that that my generation grew up with was all about the supremacy of the state and the supremacy of the tribe above all else. I grew up in Israel, for those of you who don't know. And in Israel, in the days where I grew up, this was it. The whole purpose of growing up was to go to the army and serve. That was it. That was the whole purpose of life. And I rebelled against that. Right? I rebelled against that and left Israel partially because of that, because I wanted freedom first, not the state first. And I'm willing to fight for that freedom. I'm willing to engage in a fight for it. But it has to be for my freedom, not for some abstraction called the state that I might affiliate with, I might not affiliate with, I might love or not love. And if I love the state, if I love a state, I want to have good reason to love it. Right? I used to love the U.S. a lot more 20 years ago than I do today. I was a bigger patriot of the United States of America 20 years ago than I am today. Because its ideas changed. Its system of government is changing, sadly. And there's less to love. So love has to be earned. I don't believe in unearned love for anything. So I say freedom first. I say nation because, love your nation because it advances your freedom. And love free nations. I have enormous respect for free nations. I think, again, one of the reasons to support Ukraine is that Ukraine was moving towards freedom. It was very imperfect, but it was moving towards freedom. And Russia's not. Russia's moving towards authoritarianism and has for, really since Putin came to power. So one is the good guy and one is the bad guy. I think it's much more clear-cut from the perspective of freedom first. The freedom, and let me, one last comment, and I know you're eager to jump in. We have to define freedom because it's really crucial. If you go in front of a group of communists and you say, I love freedom, they all say, we do too. Everybody loves freedom in the world, but we don't all define the word the same way. So it's really important to define what we mean by freedom. And I define freedom as the absence of coercion against, freedom is an individual thing, and it represents the absence of coercion, the absence of force, the absence of an authority that imposes itself on you. That's what freedom is. It's the absence. It's the opportunity to live your life based on your judgment, pursuing your values. That's what freedom, to me, means. So it doesn't mean the same thing to a communist. And it means something very different to different. So when we talk about freedom, we should be careful to define our terms.
Look, just very quickly, freedom first. If you want freedom from the state, you're not going to get it if you just are focused on your own freedom as an individual. Really, the only thing you can do there is emigrate and just leave. But what would have happened, say, to Poland in the 70s and in the 80s? Those great resistance movements that wanted to secure freedom and knew that in order to do it, they needed to gather together as a nation or as groups that they believed made up the nation against state tyranny. And the reason they did that was not because they just loved the principles of freedom and decided to go off to a country that practiced freedom better, but because they loved their country so much that they hated what the Soviets were doing to it. And so that even though Poland was in a state of unfreedom in the 70s, their love for Poland is what motivated them to secure freedom for Poland. All of the examples that Yaron adduced, Britain in certain phases, the northern states in America, all of those, yes, maybe came close to the libertarian ideal. But what is true of all of them, including Switzerland? A stable, ordered nation state that was at ease with itself, that was relatively homogeneous, that was in cultural terms, ethnically and religiously, they were, in other words, ordered societies. That was what made freedom possible.
I'd argue that the United States is very much a counterexample to that. It was not ordered. It was not homogeneous.
It shared customs,
particularly not in the 19th century after you sent all your poor and oppressed minorities over to the United States. No, it's what made America America was the founding principles, and the founding principles were individual liberty. The founding document of America, the Declaration of Independence, is a declaration of individual freedom, individual liberty. It's a declaration of individual rights. It elevates those rights above everything else. And the nation is there formed not for you to serve it. The nation is there, the nation is formed in order to protect the rights of the individual, to protect the life of the individual and his ability to pursue his own values. And I think it's the first and only moral country to ever be formed, because it was formed on a moral principle, the principle of individual rights.
That founding document begins with the word "we." Not me.
Sure.
Okay. Let's go to the next question.
So, unfortunately, Mr. Orr, I'm going to ask you to speak outside of British conservatism on this question, and I don't think you mind speaking internationally, Mr. Brooks. But I have a separate question for each of you. My question to you, Mr. Orr, is, so there has been a kind of successful conservative movements that have come in places in Eastern Europe. I'm thinking here of places like Hungary, of Poland, that managed to gain their freedom from totalitarianism and generated a conservative movement. But in a place like South Africa, which doesn't have the geographical convenience of the Eastern European countries, a conservatism and a national conservatism has certainly struggled to take root, because fundamentally, there is not really a South African nation. There is a group of ethnicities occupying the landmass of South Africa. And so how do you create a kind of national identity in a country that has all of the trappings necessary and all of the kind of, let's say, legislation in place to become a kind of free country and a Western liberal democracy? And then to Mr. Brooks, I have to ask, how do you take the kind of principles and ideas of freedom and individualism, and how do you fight for them in countries in which they are trampled on? What is the message that you think would be most effective, and does the kind of process to move to a society that respects individual rights, does it almost not necessarily involve the use of violence and the trampling of those rights to create the societies? Thank you.
You want to start?
Thank you. Look, I wish I had an answer or solution to give you, but but I don't, and I'm not sure I even accept that South Africa in its current state has the constitutional blueprint that could enable any kind of emancipation or a sense of national belonging that could transcend the ethnic hostility that is being whipped up by the ANC, which I think at this point is nothing other than a vast criminal gang, not a government. And the very first thing that I would do is rescind the 2004 constitution, which bakes in to the infrastructure of South Africa and the economy of South Africa plainly iniquitous principles of weaponized affirmative action and so on and so forth that make the conditions of freedom, economic or otherwise, all but impossible. So that's where I would start. But I wish you weren't having to start in that place.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that South Africa is a mess. And partially it's a mess because it now has a lengthy tradition of ethnic segregation and thinking about everything in terms of ethnicity. That goes and skin color. That goes back to, of course, apartheid and the existence of apartheid. I was in South Africa, visited South Africa during apartheid, and it was horrific and disgusting what was going on there, and should have been condemned. But it was not replaced by anything. It was replaced by the same kind of discrimination, just in reverse, without any real solution. And look, the only solution for South Africa is individualism. The only solution for South Africa is to stop looking at people in terms of where they come from, stop looking at people in terms of the color of their skin, stop looking at people in terms of what tribe they belong to, and treat them as individuals and establish a constitution that is based on that idea of individuals, and you could do worse than looking at the American Constitution as a start for that and its Declaration of Independence. And in terms of the question you're asking me, I think the only way to move any society anywhere is through education. I don't think there's any alternative to it. It's hard work. It takes a long time. It's not easy, particularly when you're a radical and you're presenting ideas that are not popular on either left or right, it turns out. You've got to just do the hard work of talking, writing, talking, and writing. There's just no alternative. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Teach people about the values and why they should adopt yours.
Okay, 1 minute.
Just very quickly, I'll add to this. It seems to me that if you are a white South African living in South Africa at the moment, that there are basically two options. One, emigrate. This is what many of them are doing now. The only other thing I have seen is the emergence of, and my gosh, how heartbreaking is this? 20 years on from, 30 years on from the collapse of the moral horrors of apartheid. White-owned, mono-ethnic, monocultural city-states, Orania, I think it's called, where effectively Afrikaners, farmers are getting together. They know that they know that they can't defeat the ANC or protect themselves exercising their individual freedoms. They know that they have to, at this point, tragic as it is, gather together against a group that is implacably opposed to them because of the color of their skin. Now, of course, that is tragic, but I note that is not the only response that is working, short of emigrating, is forming collectives, not exercising individual freedoms that would lead you to arrest and disappearance if you raise your head above the parapet.
Okay. Just for a little housekeeping, we have 6 minutes left until lunchtime. So we're going to do one more quick question. Matthias, quick answers, and then we'll wrap it up. I'm sorry, we can't get to all the questions.
Thank you. I was going to ask you about your view on human nature, but I changed my mind because I wanted to ask a question that is closer to my heart. One of the most important freedoms for me personally is the freedom to be able to live with my family in a community that is dominated by traditional Swedish culture and identity. And you say, Mr. Brooks, that you're opposed to imposing values on others. And also you say that you're in favor of complete free movement of people throughout the globe. So the result of if your ideas were to become true, there wouldn't be any place left for me in the world to exercise my freedom to live in a community that is dominated by traditional Swedish culture. And for this to happen, I guess you would have to cooperate with others to change the laws in Sweden so that would happen. Couldn't it be argued then that you would form a collective that would impose your values on me and take my freedom away?
No, I think that you're completely free to associate with whoever you want and to live in a community with whoever you want. It's just that how big of that community and how much of that community is imposed on other people. So you can find 100 other families and live together in in a community based on your traditional values. It's when you try to impose your values on me, on others, that I object, and I think that's wrong. Just as wrong as when you're offended by people's attempt to impose their values on you. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think there are good values and bad values. I do believe that there's good, there's right and there's wrong, and there's good and there's evil. And I think, you know, if we're talking about immigration, which you alluded to, one of the real failures of the West is a failure to assimilate. A failure not to impose values, but to expect people to rise to the values that the West has, and certainly to impose the law, right? One of the problems in Sweden today is you have neighborhoods where you don't send policemen in, right? I mean, that's absurd and that's ridiculous. That's not living by the rule of law. That's no individualist is going to argue, yeah, you know, they can commit crimes over there as long as they stay over there. So if there's a rule of law, apply the rule of law. But if you want to live with other people who share your values, create a community and live that way. That's great. But don't impose it on me. And as soon as you use politics to do it, as soon as you get to the issue of a government, then now you're imposing your values on other people. And that is wrong.
So can I just add, where does this crisis, the seeming inability to achieve assimilation and integration come from? Well, I would say that one of the places it comes from is a culture, as Roger Scruton put it, a culture of self-repudiation, a culture of national self-hatred, a repudiation of our statues, of our history, of our founding myths, of what makes the Swedes Swedish, what makes the Brits British. And without that kind of self-confidence in our past and who we are as a people, not as just an aggregate collection of individuals, but as a people, as a society, as a culture with a long history, a culture that can say what it means to be Swedish or British or Italian or whatever. Only there, with that kind of self-confidence, is there something to assimilate into. I don't understand on the libertarian picture, the sort of aggregate of atomized individuals just exercising their freedom. What do we need to assimilate into?
Well, here I think, again, the United States is the perfect example of this. The United States is a country with very little history that has done a better job assimilating people into it than any other country in all of human history. And it is done so on the principle of, what are they assimilating to? They're assimilating into a society that respects individual freedom, individual liberty. And that is the expectation. The expectation is to respect the rights of your neighbor. And as long as he doesn't have his, Thomas Jefferson, kind of paraphrasing, said, as long as he doesn't have his hand in your pocket, leave him alone. He's none of your business.
Okay. We now have 1 minute left, so I'm going to take my moderator's prerogative and close this session by first thanking our very able speakers for not only articulating some of these areas in which there's a great deal of tension, but helping to pull out those things we can perhaps find we share in common, or can at least find common ground to discuss it. So I want to thank them for that. And perhaps I could identify just 3 things. Perhaps we can say that our common enemy is the French Revolution, perhaps for different reasons, or collectivism, so long as we agree that communities are not collectives as such. perhaps we can simply agree that we are a big, noisy, opinionated, extended family who can fight one another, but when we are under attack, and I think we are under attack, we have to stand together against that. So thank you very much and enjoy your lunch. Thanks.